Is a paranormal and fantasy romance author who loves misunderstood mystical monsters, redeemable anti-heroes, and epic happily ever afters. A woman of many creative pursuits, Aurora is also a professional musician and visual artist. She currently resides in Montreal with her trusty espresso machine and her endlessly patient husband, whom she sometimes doesn't see for hours until she emerges from her writing cave like a bear in springtime. So, Aurora, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We've had a few moments of trying to get things to work here, so I think everything's good now. So you're in Montreal.
Yes,
And I'm in Regina,
for...
so there you go. There's
awesome.
some sort of connection. That's a
Canadians.
I mean, I remember when we moved up here from Texas when I was 8 years old. It was 1967, and I was excited because we had learned about Expo 67 in school in Texas, and I said,
"Oh wow,
we're going to Canada. I can go to Expo 67." And my parents had to gently point out that Regina was just as far from Montreal as Texas was from Montreal, just in a different direction, same distance. So, unfortunately, I didn't get to Expo 67, but I have been to Montreal.
Too bad. The buildings are still mostly there, so you could.
Yeah, I was there just last year or so. We were on we took a trip down the river and went by the island over there, and yeah, saw some of the things that are. My wife was there during '67, but she was like 4 at the time, so 3 or something.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, let's talk about you, and we'll start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. By the way, as a professional musician, are you an instrumentalist or a singer?
Yeah, I'm a piano player.
I'm a singer myself. So.
Oh, neat.
So let's find out where you were born and grew up and how you got interested in writing and storytelling.
Cool. So yeah, I was actually born in Alberta, but I grew up in BC, and I lived in BC.
You've covered the country.
My whole life. Yeah. I've traveled across Canada about like 10 or 15 times now, if you count both ways. So yeah, I've gotten around. But yeah, I grew up in BC. I lived in Vernon until I was about 20, and then I went traveling for a few years, and then when I got back, we moved to Montreal. And yeah, I always played music. That was always my thing. I grew up playing classical piano, and I was very serious about it as a child. And then when I, teenager phase rolled around, I was like, dropped everything and went on a, tangent to do whatever. But when I moved to Montreal, originally we moved here for the music, just because the city's so amazing for culture and music and art. But yeah, it was, I don't know. Well, I guess it all started when I had this job that was really boring. I was working at like a juice bar, and there was nobody, there was like no customers. Like looking back, I just laugh because I'm like, why didn't they just close this business? Like they were paying me for, anyway, I had so much time. So I started reading, and I was a voracious reader as a kid, but I hadn't read a book in like, it had to have been like 15 years or something. And and then I stumbled upon the vampire romance was the first romance books that I ever read. And I was like, what is this? I was totally obsessed. So yeah, I think I was reading obsessively for about 3 or 4 years before it occurred to me to write something.
What kind of stuff were you reading as a kid before the music? I presume it was the music that basically took over everything else.
Yeah, I read a lot of like fantasy, like, Harry Potter, and like, I don't know if you know, like the Redwall books. Yep. I remember loving
Brian
those
Jacques.
As a kid. Yeah. I remember I had braces when I was little, and every time I got them tightened, like it really, really hurt. I still remember how much that hurt, so it must have really hurt because I was a kid. But I would sit down with before I got my braces tightened, my mom would take me to the library and I'd get a new Redwall book. And then after, I would sit down in my chair in my bedroom and read the whole book, like cover to cover and then by the time I made it through the book, my mouth would stop hurting as much. It was like my system.
Did you try writing stories at all as a kid?
Not really. No, like I had a few, not stories, but I did some writing. And I remember in high school, I did some like creative writing things, and my teachers were always like, "Oh, you have a really like you have a knack for writing, and like you should consider writing." And I was like, nah." Like I really never thought about it. It was always music.
So after the juice bar and the voracious reading of vampire romance, was the book that we're going to talk about, was that what you wrote, or were there other experimental writings in there before you got to something publishable?
Yeah, I actually wrote an entire 4-book series that I haven't published.
Good practice, though.
Yeah, and I really love that series, and it was like really what got me into writing. But like, like my husband, he'll be like, "Why don't you publish those books?" Because he's like the only person that's read them, and I'm like, "Not yet." Like, like maybe one day. But that was the first thing that I wrote. It was a paranormal romance, and yeah, it was like this complete 4-book series. And like when I finished that, it was very set in like North America and well around the world. There were different places, but it was in the real world. And there were some places that I had never been to. And I ended up doing so much research. Like I was on Google Earth.
Yeah, Google Earth is very useful for that.
Yeah, like walking the streets of this city I've never been to. And so when I finished that, it took me a few years to write that whole series. I was figuring out how to write, and I was, plotting and all this stuff. But so when I finished, I was like, oh my gosh, I just want to write something that's like just totally not real so that I can just make stuff up. So that was when I started Sanctuary of the Shadow. But I soon learned that fantasy is not just an easy, world building. Fantasy is not like you just make it up. Like it's actually like almost more difficult.
Well, that's kind of what we talk about on here. That's why it's called the World Shapers. So before we get there, though, did you have any formal, do you ever take any lessons or have a writing workshop or any of that sort of thing along the way?
Not really. I did a lot of like creative work. Like I was homeschooled for elementary school. And I really loved that I got that opportunity looking back, because my mom was like, okay, if we can just get this done, what do you want to study? So I would just like get the like math and stuff out of the way. And like, then we would do, like, I did a lot of reading, and I did do creative writing to go with, my studies. I don't know if I did any like stories plotting per se, and then when I went to high school, the same thing. I had like teachers that encouraged me and like stuff like that, but I never did any like university formal training or anything like that.
Well, I would say the majority of the authors that I ask who have said, it really wasn't that helpful. So,
yeah.
I always ask, and some people say, oh yeah, I had this great professor and it was really wonderful, but most of the time it's like, it wasn't actually as helpful as you'd think it might be. Most of it seems to be you learn to do by doing.
Yeah, and I have a friend that went to school for creative writing and got his master's, and he was like, it was the worst thing I ever did for my writing. I don't write anymore. Mm-hmm. So I was like, oh my God.
Dodged a bullet then, I guess.
Yeah. like he found it really, like, I don't know if that's right for everybody, but for him, it was really stifling to his creativity. And so I know I didn't feel like I really missed out on anything. Like, I think like I learned the most by doing, like you said.
Are you still actively performing as a pianist or just playing?
Yeah, I have a band. My husband's in the band with me, and then we have a drummer that plays with us. And we were doing a lot more before the pandemic. Like we used to do a tour every summer across Canada.
What's the name of the band?
We're called the Ohm Sound. And yeah, but we've kind of slowed down a little bit. We're just doing more like for fun and recordings. And I actually, because I started publishing and got into writing more, I kind of redirected some of my creative energy into that. So yeah.
Well, that's one.
And I don't play. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I don't play classical much anymore. It kind of. I have a complicated relationship with classical music. I love it, but it was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Like it held me back in some ways.
I was going to ask, do you think you said, so you're directing some of your creative energy now at writing, but do you see a connection there between the the musical side and the writing side as far as creativity and expression goes?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like a lot of like we when we write songs together as a band, it's like we just meet up. We have a studio that we rent and we just get together and just jam and then something sticks, and then we're like, "Oh, I like that." And then we kind of like play with that and then like do some variations and it turns into a song. So it's kind of like that with writing in a way, like you just have a bunch of weird ideas in your head and then something sticks and you're like, no, that's the idea, that's the right one. I'm gonna go with that.
Is there any music in the book?
Like part of the story?
Yeah, or
No, not
musicians,
really.
or so. Um,
Not no, not really. I've written books about. I have a book that's about a musician. It's like my other. I have an indie series as well, and that book takes place in Montreal. It's about a demon, and he plays jazz. So
what else would a demon play?
yeah, of course.
Well, let's talk about Sanctuary of the Shadow, and I think the place
Cool.
to start is with a synopsis that does not give away anything you don't want to give away.
Okay, so this is a synopsis that I'm going to just create from my mind. So bear with me here. But I guess um, it follows Harrow, and we know that she's survived like the tragedy of losing her family, and she's living in a circus. They're like a traveling circus, and there's people in this world called elementals, and they're people that are like gifted with the elemental magic. And so this circus is all elementals, all the people that work there, and they perform like for humans, and they're kind of like shunned by the human society for being different, and because there's this really long-term conflict going on between the queens, and they're like the rulers of the world, but they're kind of corrupt or just kind of morally ambiguous, and they're not really interested in, they don't have the people's best interests. So there's this complicated relationship with the humans and elementals, and the circus is kind of a way for them to like make a living and make a way for themselves in the world where they're not really welcome anymore. So Harrow's kind of in this scenario, and she ends up meeting a mysterious man who arrives at the circus under questionable circumstances, i.e., he is trapped in a cage.
hmm
And yeah, so it's about they have a connection, and the book is exploring like the past and kind of coming to terms with, you know, the pain of loss, and also her need for revenge, and also there's a big theme of like forgiveness, and we find out all these threads are all connected to this big picture.
Well, this is where I ask the question that authors hate to be asked, but it's a legitimate question. It's usually phrased, "Where do you get your ideas?" which authors really hate. And of course, the famous answer was Harlan Ellison, who said there was a service he subscribed to that delivered ideas to a post office box in Schenectady, New York, and he'd pick them up once a year or something like that. So let's say instead, what was the seed from which this story grew? Why did you go in this direction with this particular story?
So this book actually has a couple really funny, like weird moments that sort of birthed it. So like the first thing being what I mentioned earlier, where I was like, I just want to write something, like at the time I thought I would be so free, just making anything up. So that was my first kind of thought, that I wanted to do a fantasy that was, in a different world, different everything. And then at the time that I had the idea, I was on tour with my band, as we mentioned. And there was this moment where in my hometown, we have this beautiful lake, Kalamalka Lake. And it's this turquoise, it's just like this magic lake. I don't know, there's nothing like it in the world. It's one of the most beautiful things. And I was swimming underwater in the lake, and I opened my eyes and I was like looking around, and I just had this weird moment of like, I was thinking like, I wonder if you could like capture this in writing, like this feeling of like floating and you're just like weightless and it's like blue everywhere. And then, so yeah, and that comes out in the book as Harrow. She's a elemental. She's a water elemental, and she has visions throughout the book of floating in water like that. So that was where that came to me randomly. And then, but that was just like a weird idea at the time. And then during that tour, we were driving through Northern Ontario, and this is long stretch of nothing. And
there's an Arrogant Worm song about that. I don't know if you've ever heard
it. I have. I definitely have. Yeah. And yeah, so there was this sign, and it said like Wraith Road, and it was this weird spelling it didn't have a W, and I was like, oh, that's a cool name, whatever. And then later on, and I have never been able to find the sign to this day. We've done the road trip like 3 or 4 more times since then, but I saw a sign, I swear to this day, that said Harrow, like Harrow Lake or Harrow Street or something. And this was like, hours later. And I was like, oh, I also like that name. And like, that was my 2 characters. So like, and then it was just like the combination of like knowing I wanted to write fantasy, and then that weird feeling in the lake, and then those 2 names, that it kind of just like became the story.
Where did the circus come from?
Well, I guess that would be, there's a lot of circus, like Montreal is actually considered the circus capital of the world. Like, and I always thought
permanent
like
Cirque du Soleil.
Exactly. Yeah. Cirque du Soleil came out of Montreal, and there's like a really famous circus school here. I forget the name right now, but like, and like we went to a show there just recently, and I was talking to a girl, and she was from BC, I think, but she had spent like the last couple years in Europe, in Germany, and like all these places, and she was like, no, like Montreal is the best place for circus. She was working in the circus, and she was like, I came back here because it's like I've never been anywhere with a better circus community. So there's just this like, I have friends that like just randomly, they're friends that also are like professional aerial silk circus people, and it's just like it's really easy to be in the community, and you can just go to circus school. Like there's multiple circus schools all over the city. So it's just like, it's something that I wasn't really exposed to until I moved here, and yet it's so normal here. Like everyone does circus. If you go to a music festival, there's like professional circus people everywhere. So it was just something that I thought would be fun to write about as kind of an homage to Montreal as well, in a subtle way.
I'm sure there must be other... A fantasy circus would seem to make a lot of sense, and yet I can't off the top of my head think of another example. I do know a science fiction series, which would long predate you, by Barry B. Longyear, which is about a space-going circus. Basically, there's a planet descended entirely from the population of a crashed spaceship that was carrying a circus, so it's literally Circus World.
Wow,
I remember reading those, really enjoying those, but they came out about 1981, somewhere in the early 80s. So,
oh, that's super cool.
Yeah, you should look them up. But
yeah,
in your case, so you had this idea. You talked already about how you found out that there is, in fact, a lot of work that goes into creating a fantasy world. What was your planning and kind of process, and also outlining? Do you create an outline, or how do you get ready to start writing?
I have a complicated relationship with outlining. I'm definitely more of a pantser, as they call it. I tend to, like I was saying earlier, I tend to get like an idea, a lot of different weird ideas, and then there's just one that kind of feels right. So the first few books I wrote, I genuinely just started writing stuff, and then when I finished a scene, I would just just somehow write the next scene. And then as I moved on my writing career, I started being like, okay, I need to try to like make this into some kind of process, so it's not quite so like, whoa, like, who knows what's going to happen next. So I've started working, like what I would do is I would plot by just writing like pages and pages of notes. And then often I would just never look at the notes, but just the act of writing them would kind of, like I would just remember what I wrote usually.
Yeah, there's something about writing it down that helps it cement it in your head.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And yeah, I had this really bad habit that I'm still trying to break of plotting my next day's writing like while I'm trying to fall asleep. So I'm like, I go to bed, I'm laying down, it's dark, and it's such a good time to like, I mean, good or bad depending on how much you want to sleep, but like time to plot things because there's like no disturbances, like everything's quiet. So I would often think about like the next day's writing, like, okay, I finished this scene today. Where am I going to go with the book tomorrow? And so then I would plot the next scene like that night, and then I would write it the next day. But now I'm trying to stop that habit because I feel like it's making it really hard for me to fall asleep. Like lately I've been like, oh my God.
Yeah,
So
I've run into that too. If I think too much about writing, it just wakes your brain up, and it
yeah.
makes it harder to sleep.
And if like it works great if it's just like you're just like, oh, that'd be cool to try. Okay, you know. But if you're like, I feel like I've run into times where I'm a little stuck on something or whatever, and then I end up lying there for like 2 hours, like running over all the plots and like, you know, and it's like I'm like, okay, so now I'm trying to do a thing where if that, you know, closed eyes, quiet time visualizing helps me, like I just like do that as part of my writing process. So like sometimes I just like sit in my chair and like put my head down on the desk, you know, on my arms, and just close my eyes and just like think and try to recreate that feeling without having to, you know, disrupt my sleep.
That if you did disrupt your sleep and you put your head down on your desk, you'll fall asleep at your desk. He said, I would.
I don't really have that problem. Like for me, it's like I need to, whenever I could sleep, it's a good thing. I'm not a great sleeper.
So what were some of the challenges in building, designing the world for this fantasy?
Yeah, I guess like I had a couple places that were really strongly in my mind. Like Allegra is the city. I think that's the most like the circus travels around, but Allegra is kind of where they spend the most time in the book. And that city I kind of loosely based off of, or not based, but just inspired by Varanasi in India. It's just this amazing ancient city. And if you go to the Ghats, there's like these tiny little winding, narrow alleys, and it's so easy to get lost. And like Google Maps has no clue how to map it. It's just like, it just like grays it out and puts some lines, like it doesn't know. And it's just, it's just really magical. You feel like when you're there, you feel like streets could disappear and like reappear, you know, and you'd have no idea. So I kind of was inspired by that a little bit when I created that city.
How do you
But
spell
then there
that?
were other places. Varanasi?
I know, Allegra.
Allegra, yeah. It's like Allegra.
The only reason I asked was because I know there was actually a Cirque du Soleil performance called Allegria. So that's what I immediately thought of, because we've been talking about Cirque.
Allegro comes from, it's a musical term.
Yeah,
like it means it's like, yeah. So I think it's like related to that. That's probably where I subconsciously got it from too.
So as you had your city you had to plan out, you also had things to, I mean, what kind of research did you end up having to do for everything in the book? There's also all that circus stuff.
Right. So yeah, there were some places that came to me really easily, like Allegra, and there were other places that I had to kind of, like you had to be like, okay, what makes logical sense? and so like I was like, okay, we have rivers here. So where's the river going? Where, you know, these are the things that I wasn't expecting when I first started. You know, you're like, okay, this river needs to logically come from somewhere and it needs to logically go somewhere. And so little things like that, planning where where rivers go, where cities are, what's the distance between these places, how long does it take to travel, and like if you're drawing that on a map, you know, you have to be like, what's the actual, you know, physical distance on the map if it takes them a week or whatever.
Did you draw a map?
I did.
You're also a visual artist, so
yeah, I had they did a beautiful one for in the book. It's printed in the book. That wasn't my doing, but I had a really like terrible one that I drawn, like a really rough sketch just for my visual. So then when they asked me if I had a map, I was like, well, I do. Whether or not you'll be able to read it. But yeah, the map that is in Sanctuary is based off of the one that I drew.
When I was a kid, I
It's
always
much
thought
more
that
beautiful.
that's how you could tell serious fantasy books. They had maps.
Yeah, they are so cool.
Because Lord of the Rings, of course, has a very famous map. And
Yeah.
so,
There were actually things, side note, in Lord of the Rings, in the map, that I actually thought about when I was thinking of mine. Because those books, they're like the origin of fantasy, but so they've also been like kind of nitpicked a little bit, and people have pointed out like this mountain range makes no sense geographically, and like I don't know if you've ever heard people say that the maps are
yeah,
like
I've seen
technically,
panels on it at conventions.
yeah. So
Like you'll have
that
some
actually
geologist saying, "Well, really,
technically,
or else there was I don't remember who he was. I think he was from the University of Saskatchewan, but I think he actually had managed to rationalize it. So he was explaining what would have had to have happened in the past to create this map, as opposed to saying you couldn't have this map. I think it was
oh,
more
I
along
like
those
that.
lines.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, because then you're like it's fantasy, you know.
Yeah,
But I did think about that when I was doing my own map, being like, I was like, okay, I'm not a geologist at all, and I'm sure you can find things if you want to go through it with that eye and find things that aren't correct. But I did think like, okay, let's put the mountains here, and we'll make the rivers come out of the mountains.
yeah. As long as they
You
flow
know?
downhill, you're
Yeah.
going all right.
Yeah, and maybe it helped that I grew up in BC, so we have lots of glacier lakes and rivers and things.
Here in Saskatchewan, you can never tell which way the rivers are flowing unless you throw something in them because it's so flat. So,
And like that, where did it come from? Like which mountains, and like is it emptying in the St. Lawrence, or is it going all the way back to the Pacific? It's crazy.
yeah. So once you had all of this, done all this world building and whatever level of outlining you did, what did your actual writing process look like? Did you, sit under a tree with a quill pen, or how do you like to work?
Yeah, usually my writing sort of ritual, you could say, has evolved over the years. When I first started writing, I guess it's my personality type. When I get into something, I'm very fixated. So like when I first started writing, I would sit and I would write for like 5 hours, and I would do nothing else. I wouldn't eat. Like I was totally obsessed. But like after a few years, like it becomes part of your life, and that kind of obsession tends to like settle down, and you have to kind of find a way to do it more sustainably. So what I tend to do is write 1 or 2 hours. And if I'm really going, I'll do 3 or 4, but that's kind of, and I like to write in the mornings. I have my little writing set up with my computer and my keyboard, and I always make a latte with my espresso machine. And there have been times when we've been on tour or traveling that I do write on the road. And I do love finding places that I can write when I'm kind of on the go. Like I love writing in cafes. And like when we're traveling, I really love stopping in new towns and cities and finding a cafe to work in.
I tried writing on the road, but it's so hard to pull up the pavement and take your words with you afterwards. So, sorry, bad joke. So, are you a fast writer, slow writer? How quickly do you crank out the words?
I think it depends on where I'm at with the story, and also where I'm at with myself. Like, I've written a book in 30 days before. Like it was just like, it just happened. And then other books have taken me like a year.
Mm-hmm.
So it just depends, like where I'm at, like I said, like whether there's a lot going on in my life, or whether, I don't know, just energy levels and like what's happening. And then I think also where I am in the book, or even in the series. Like writing the last book in a series is a lot more pressure than starting the first book for me, because you're just so open and you can just try anything. And it's like, whereas the last book, you're just kind of piecing together threads from all the other books, and you want it to fit. So like I tend to write a lot slower in that scenario than I would if I was just purely exploring new ideas.
Well, George R. R. Martin has taken 12 years and still hasn't finished that next book. So And apparently he hasn't written anything in the last year to speak of. So
Oh, I feel bad for him, honestly. Like, can you imagine the pressure?
Yeah.
Like,
But he's done all right otherwise. So.
yeah, for real. He's fine. He's fine. He could never write another word and he would be set.
How long is the book? Word-wise?
Pages, word-wise, I think it's about 105,000.
So pretty standard.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
usually what mine turn out to be, somewhere in that neighborhood. Once you had well, first of all, as you're writing, are you just barreling through start to finish? Do you revise as you go? So in other words, do you end up with a really raw first draft, or do you kind of work on it as you go and end up with something that's a little more finished before you go back for your revision rounds?
I think I tend to do light revising as I go. And I think I've heard some writers say like not to read what you've written because you'll get stuck in the trap of editing forever. But for me, I find if I'm not quite sure, like say I had to take a day off or I'm just not quite sure where to go, going back and like reading at least the chapter before, if not two chapters, can help me remember like it's like it puts me back in my characters' heads and be like, what were they thinking in this scene? So that it just, for me, it's like it connects it easier. So, and then if I'm going back to reread, then I tend to just like do a little bit of editing as I go. And then I love the leaving comments is like that's like my main sort of self-direction tool. So if there's something major that I want to change, I've learned the hard way not to change it until I'm absolutely sure, because I've had times where I was like, oh, no, instead of this, I'm going to do that. I go back, I change everything, I get back, and then I write a little further and I realize, no, that doesn't work. And I have to go back and change it all back. So now what I do is if I'm like, oh, I really need to change this, I think, I go back and I leave comments and I say, okay, I'm going to try changing this major thing, and I'll come back and revisit this and rewrite this scene and this scene and this scene if I do change it. And then I'll write as if I had already done that work. And then if I get further on in the book and I realize, yep, definitely this is what I'm doing, then I might go back and change that.
I usually try
afterward.
to keep, if I excise something because I've gone in a different direction, but it's quite major, I'll often take out what I've already written and put it aside in another file so that if I change my mind and I want that original thing or chunks of it, I don't have to recreate it from scratch. I always keep everything. I have like a file, like I use Drive, so I have like this little folder within the book folder that says old. And then like anything that I've like changed or deleted goes in the old file. And then sometimes I find myself going back in that folder being like, where was that chapter? Because I need this one paragraph, that described it perfectly. Or I'm like, I'm going to go back to this original way or whatever. And I keep, it's all there. It's, computers have made things much easier than when I started writing, which was still typewriter era. So,
oh, wow. I can't even imagine. That would be very challenging.
No, I still write that way, I think. And I have talked, I think it was John Scalzi, one of my very earliest interviews on here. He does a rolling revision, so by the time he gets to the end, he's pretty much already got it polished up. So he's one of those that actually does work on it all through the writing process. And he said that in his experience, he's found that some of us older writers who did start writing in the days of pre-word processor, at least pre-home word processors, we tend to write start to finish, bang out a draft, and then go back and revise, because on typewriters, the best you could do is go back and mark it up with pen and ink. And some authors did that. My standard has always been start at the beginning, write all the way to the end. Occasionally, sometimes I get stuck and have to back up and redo something, but mostly I type as if I'm on a typewriter, and then I do all my revising after I get to the end. And some other writers of my vintage I've talked to tend to do that as well.
I think that's a great system. Like, it's if it works for you, it's like I think it's ideal, because it's like like sometimes the hardest thing is to just get the words out, and then it's out. Like, there's the book. I can now fix anything as long as I've written it.
I think, and my very first guest was Robert J. Sawyer, and he referred to, I think the term came from Ado van Belkom, whom I've also interviewed. I've interviewed a lot of people on here, which is why
Wow.
there is no one way to do this. Everybody's different. But
Yeah.
he referred to the vomit draft, which is you just get it all out on the paper. It's like throwing up, and it's a mess, but you feel better once it's out there. And then you have to clean it up. So I think that's a pretty good metaphor.
Yeah.
Not a kind of a disgusting metaphor, but still.
Yeah, it works. I've always found the editing process really fun. Like I think some people like think it's such a drag, but I really like it. So I do think there's a lot of value in just like getting the words out. And it's like, and like sometimes if I'm stuck or blocked, I'll just tell myself like, write the most garbage chapter you've ever, like just such a terrible chapter, but just write it. So then I'll be like, okay, I'm just going to write the worst thing I've ever written. And then of course it's never that bad. It's just in your head. But it's on the words are on the page and you can always fix it.
Yeah, and a lot of I think the biggest problem in writing is just getting going. So if you're, get something going and then the words start to flow. Well, let's talk about your revision process. So you've got whatever the first draft or however you think of it. You've gotten to the end of the story and you say you like editing. So what do you go back and how do you do that?
Yeah, I have maybe it's because I'm a bit of a control freak or something, but I tend to do a lot of editing myself. So I tend to go back and I just read the book like again and again and again. Like I think I must read the book like 5 times before I send it out to people. And like, I don't know, I have this weird skill of where I can kind of dissociate from myself and read it as a reader. So I read it on my like iPad, and then I read it on my phone, and then I read it on my computer, and then I read it in a cafe on my computer and in a cafe so it's like I'm putting it in a different format. And like I try to just see it through like different eyes. And
do you give it a rest after you finish before you start?
No, not usually. I just go right back to the beginning and start reading it. And I think just reading it as a reader for me is a huge part of finding out like what, like,
do you take notes as you're doing
working
that?
Or yeah, comments. I'll just leave comments. I love comments. So I'll just read, and then as I'm reading, I'll be like, this part's really boring. Like, I'm not into this. Or then I'll read again and be like, no, I really like this. I think we need to explore this more. Or I'll be like, I feel like this whole chapter could be condensed into, like, so that's like my revising first read through is I just take notes and I'm like, what could happen here? Oh, I think this needs to be expanded. This needs to be less, like this part. And I'll even leave notes like I laughed. Like sometimes I'll laugh at something I wrote and like I won't even remember that it was supposed to be funny. So it's like just little things like that help me remember when I'm editing, like to approach it as a reader, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And once you've read it 5 times, and this reminds me, people will say, oh, your book is, you just got your book. Are you going to read it now? I said, no, I'm not going to read it after it's printed.
Yeah,
I've read it. Thanks.
Never going to read it again.
Except for public readings and that sort of thing. But
yeah.
So then once you've got all these notes, what's the next step?
Yeah, then I'll go through. I also do more pages of notes about the comments I made. So like,
now you're commenting on the comments?
Yeah, exactly. I'll make a list of a kind of like a to-do list, like as I go through and I write a bunch of comments, I might go back and quickly like read the comments and then compile that into kind of a checklist. And then once I've gone back and I've just like gone through like the really heavy, hard edits, usually I do like one solid round of that. And if I have time, I like to do a second one, but the second one's a little overkill. Like, I think that's just perfection brain. But at least one really hard, like complete overhaul of the book. And then I would send it to my beta readers.
So where did you find your beta readers and how many do you have?
So right now I just have 3. One of them is my husband and one of them is another friend of mine, and both of them then the third person is I actually have like 2 different people that I kind of have kind of like taken turns lately. But my husband started reading for me just because he's also a reader. He also loves fantasy, and he's not like he's not a romance reader, but he's not like, he doesn't like obsessively only read romance the way that I do. So I actually really like his perspective because he just brings the like questions about stuff that often us romance readers overlook, like something random about a side character that no one cares about, and he'll be like, well, what about this guy? And I'm like, what about that guy? Like I should fix that up a bit. And then my other long-term beta reader is she writes small town like contemporary romance, so like very different than me, and we beta read for each other. And again, I think we're both romance authors, so that's helpful because we understand like character dynamics and plotting and how to even write a book. But because we both write such different genres, I think that perspective is really helpful for me, again, because she doesn't know the rules, quote unquote, of fantasy. So she might be like, what does that mean? Or like, what is this? Or things that I think are obvious. So that is a good way for me to make sure I don't fall into the trap of assuming my readers know everything. And so I actually like expand.
What defines, in your mind, a fantasy romance as opposed to a fantasy? I mean, your synopsis sounds like a fantasy novel that has romance in it, but the fact that it's actually a romance novel, are there extra expectations there for the romance part of the story?
So like the romance kind of formula, if you could say, is a romance that thinks that's something romance will always have the romance as the central plot, and the things that happen in the book like are not part of it, but like the romance is the main theme of the book. So you could, if you took out the romance, there wouldn't be a book. But if you have a romantic fantasy, for example, you could probably still have a good book if you took out the romance. So that's kind of where the line is. Like the primary focus of the book is on the two main characters and their love story and how it unfolds. And like these challenges that come up in the book, the conflicts, usually have to do with their love story. And like there's usually some kind of thing that's like, why can't the characters be together? Why can't they be happy? And the plot of the book is about resolving that, or making a way. And if you took away that love story, that there would no longer be a plot, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And I have talked to one or two other romance authors, and similar response, but I like to ask. So you've sent it to the beta readers. Then what do you do with their comments when they come back? Another revision pass, I would guess.
Yeah, exactly. So I send them, the last book I wrote, I tried doing everyone's comments on one document. Usually I send them 3 different documents. But I still haven't decided which version I like better. When they see each other's comments, the plus side of that is then I told them, if you don't agree, say something. And if you do agree, say something. So then someone will be like, oh, this is a bit weird. I'm not sure what this means. And then someone else would be like, no, I completely understand what this means. So, and then I can take it with a grain of salt. So like, for example, if there's some kind of very romance specific interaction and my husband is like, I don't get this, but then my 2 other beta readers who are like primary romance readers or writers are like, no, this makes perfect sense, then I might be like, well, I think it might just be that my husband doesn't read enough romance to understand what this thing is, or something like along those lines. So like it's kind of nice having that. On the flip side, someone's comment might be influenced by what they read. So that's why I'm still not sure which is the better way, because if I give them 3 different documents and they don't see each other's comments, then if 3 people say like this part needs clarifying, then I'm like, for sure I need to work on this because none of them saw what the other person wrote.
So you've got your final, and now you have the editorial process. So what was that like on this book? How did the editorial feedback come back?
Yeah, Sanctuary is my first, like I'm a hybrid author, so I also have an indie published books. Mm-hmm. And Sanctuary was my first book with a publishing company. And it was the first book that I got to work with Molly, my editor, and then also with a copy editor. So it was actually so nice. Like I have I just usually copy edit my indie books myself. For some reason, I have the gift of copy editing. I'm very grateful for that. I've also copy edited books for other author friends. But it's a lot of work doing it to my own book, you know, because you've been through it so many times and then you got to go back through it again. So it's a lot of work. So I really loved when I did Sanctuary, like having the help of not just like, it was like 2 different rounds of copy editing and then rounds of proofreading. And they just sent it back to me, and I was like, "This is amazing!" Like I loved it.
That extra set of eyes. I mean, I run a publishing company, and then I've been published traditionally through DAW Books. And most of my, not most, but well, many of my 12 books was DAW Books. So I'm used to that end of things. But I'm also an editor and publisher myself.
Oh yeah, so you understand.
And yeah, but it's like because I have published some of my own stuff a little bit through my publishing company and republished previous books. And I do miss that extra layer of somebody else looking at it. Mm-hmm. It does make a difference, but it's not always possible, of course, if you're indie publishing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is Entangled Publishing, right? That's the name of the company?
Yeah, Red Tower is their new adult fantasy romance line.
It's a great cover. You didn't do your own cover this time either, I would assume.
No, I didn't. Yeah, Bree Archer did it. She's works for Entangled. It's like so pretty. I love it.
Does it really? I'm looking at the 3D mock-up. It shows a pattern on the edge of the pages. Is that there in the printed book?
Yeah, so they're doing a short run kind of special edition for the first print run, and it'll have like sprayed edges, and that design will be on the edges of it.
Very
so
cool.
It's like if you get in the first print run, like when you buy it, you'll get that version. Afterwards, it'll be the normal one.
So the book comes out January 9th, which will be after this goes live, so I can't ask you how it's doing. But,
yeah.
And it's the start of a series, is it?
Yeah, it's the first book.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But before we get to what are you working on now, which is the very last question I ask, I will now ask you the big philosophical questions I warned you about. First one is, why do you write? Second one is, or they're one question. Why do you write? Why do any of us write? Why do human beings do this weird thing where we tell lies to each other and put it on paper? And the other question is, why the fantasy side of things? Why not write small town contemporary fantasy or something set in the real world? What has drawn you to the supernatural and the fantastical and the paranormal?
Oh, I like these questions. Okay, so to start, why do I write? There's a lot, like, I don't want to get into, like, my childhood, but, like, I guess as a kid, I was very quiet and kind of withdrawn, and I think I spent a lot of time in my head. And I think that I just, because of that, or maybe just that happened because I'm like this, but I just have always had a really like vivid, overactive imagination. And and I never really, like, I just thought whatever, that's just who I am. And then when I started writing, I was like, it just felt like something clicked. Like it was like I've just always had this kind of, and another thing about me was I would get really restless when I was bored. Like if I wasn't constantly busy, I would just get kind of like angsty, restless feeling, like, what am I doing right now? Like, I need to do something. And it kind of plagued me for like my whole life. And I kind of just thought it was like this weird affliction that I had. But when I started writing, it was suddenly like, I will never be bored or restless again, because I always have this thing that I want to be working on that I love. And I have this kind of outlet for all these weird images and shit in my brain, like that my brain is constantly creating and doing. So yeah, I felt like something just really clicked for me. And like, as for why everybody writes, I guess I just feel like it's part of human nature to tell stories. Like maybe it's the act of creating, like, we create if you believe that we create our reality to some extent, we're kind of creating micro universes, micro realities. It's like the same way you create a character and they are no longer yours. They are themselves. Like, it's like you really feel like they're a real person. Like, it's like that act of creating, whether it's art, music, writing, like, it's just, I feel like it's human nature.
Well, I think one of the cool things about it is that although it feels like a solitary act, it's actually collaborative, because what you create doesn't really take life until it lands in somebody else's head. And
Totally.
then each person is, in a way, creating their own version of the character that you created, because each of them is going to see that character and the story they're involved in differently. So it's very interesting how we are kind of planting ideas into each other's heads through words.
Yeah, and it's very personal. Like, you write something and it's yours and yours alone, and then you put it out in the world and you just like trust that other people are going to like it. But then when someone does like it and it does connect with them, it's just you're like, this is why I do this. It's like, I think one of the best things for me is when I just hear from people that they love my stories. Like, you're just like,
yeah, it's nice.
It's the best feeling. Yeah. Yeah. And then you asked why I write fantasy.
Yes.
I guess the answer to that would be probably related to why I write. I just love fantastical things that are just unbelievable and so, quote unquote impossible. And I as a kid, I always loved the like monster or the dragon in the story. And I would be like so sad if the dragon was like supposed to be evil. It was like, why is he evil? He just needs like love. He just needs someone to understand him, So I guess as a adult, that I kind of put that into my stories, like the terrible misunderstood monster who's really just like, he just needs a hug, kind of like. So yeah, but then you just make it more and more fantastical, like, and just unreal.
I suppose I should also ask, why the romance? Why have you gone in the romance side of things?
Yeah, the romance genre, I just love how the center, like we were talking earlier, the center of every romance plot is the characters. And like in other genres, like, and maybe this is my biased opinion, but in other genres, you can have a whole story where nothing really, like, you don't really feel like the main character. They just kind of go through events that just happen and they're just like experiencing them. But in the romance genre, like a good romance book, you have to know like where your character started in terms of mentally, and you have to know where they need to be, and then you have to come up with a way to get them there. So, if you have a character that's really shy and withdrawn, and that their ideal best self is when they open up a little bit, it's like your job as the writer to get them through that hurdle, and like whatever happens to them throughout the course of the book, they have to end up as the best version of themselves, and they have to do that with their partner. And I think I just really love that feeling of like, it's like you're helping somebody. Like, it's such a hopeful and inspiring thing to take someone who seems just so lost and so broken, and you take them through this crazy journey, and they find not only the best version of themselves, but also someone to like love them and be with them. It's just such a fulfilling kind of journey to go on.
And now, what are you working on? Presumably the next book in the series.
Yeah, the next book of the series is technically written. It's in edits right now, but like the heavy editing stage. So like it's the vomit draft.
Right.
Is that what you called it earlier? So it's in it's done,
like that.
But
Technically
it's
written, but not done.
Like, yeah, it's
a lot of writing to be done on it yet.
Exactly, yeah, lots of revisions. And I'm also working on the final book in my indie series, my paranormal romance series. So I'm kind of doing a lot.
Do you know how many books will be in the current series? Is it open-ended or?
I have, excuse me, I have 3 books for sure that I'm doing with Red Tower. And I kind of have, like, I know where those 3 books will go, Um, and ideally, I would do more books, like 5 or 6, but I do need to do some plotting work coming up. That's part of the revisions I want to do on the second book, to kind of find out like how many books I do need. Like I write standalones, so that means that at the end of each book, the couple that you're reading about, they have their like happy ending, and then the next book will have 2 new main characters, but then the old characters from previous books will feature as well. So like you could like it is like Sanctuary is a complete story, but then there's like plot that's kind of overreaching through the whole series that is ongoing. So yeah, it could be like 4 or 5 books, could be 6 books. I'm not too sure yet.
And where can people find you online so they can keep up with all this stuff you're working on?
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, auroraascher.com, and that has links to everything. I'm pretty active on social media as well, on Instagram and everything like that. I also have a mailing list.
And I will
have Patreon.
I'll have links on the World Shapers website when this goes live, which will be very shortly. So,
Sweet.
Aurora, thanks so much for being on the World Shapers. I enjoyed the chat. I hope you did as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was really fun.
And thanks again to Aurora for being such a great guest. I hope you enjoyed that chat as much as I did. That brings us to the end of episode 149 of the World Shapers. And as I said off the top, in a way, kind of the end to this specific format of the World Shapers, where it's audio only and talking about the creative process. There's one more focused on the creative process. It'll have a video component. After that, this will become more of a video component, still be an audio version. The episodes will probably be a bit shorter, and I'll be talking to authors more about new releases and in a wider variety of genres, though me being who I am, there will always be a lot of science fiction and fantasy titles featured here on the World Shapers. Just to remind you a few other things, that the World Shapers is online at theworldshapers.com. You can find it on Twitter at The World Shapers. You can find it on Facebook at The World Shapers. You can find me online at edwardwillett.com, 2 T's on Willett. You can find me at Twitter at @ewillett, on Twitter at @ewillett. You can find me on Instagram at edwardwillettauthor, all one word. You can find me on Facebook at edward.willett. And where else can you find me? Oh, yes, on YouTube, where, again, the World Shapers will start to appear as a regular audio and video feature really, on YouTube. Excuse me. And you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. I really wish you would. In addition to the World Shapers and occasionally some music and stuff, the YouTube channel also features my Walking in Regina series, which is just me walking around my hometown of Regina, Saskatchewan, and showing off the sights and blabbing away as I do. So in a way, it's kind of like a podcast itself, a vlog, I guess they call those things. Then what else should I mention? Oh yes, Shadowpaw Press. You can find Shadowpaw Press at shadowpawpress.com. You can find Shadowpaw Press on Twitter at Shadowpaw Press. You can find it on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press. There is a Shadowpaw Press YouTube channel, but I haven't really put anything there. So the Edward Willett YouTube channel, which is at Edward Willett on YouTube, is where you should go if you want to start following along on the video version of this, which will, again, start to appear in 2 weeks. That's it for this episode of The World Shapers. I hope you've enjoyed it and all of the previous episodes, and I hope you will come back as it evolves, but continues to be a place where I talk to authors about the shaping of the worlds that they create that we enjoy reading about so much. That's it for this episode. Bye for now.